George Kilpatrick Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. We're pleased to be joined by Dr. Clemmie Harris, Associate Professor and Chair of the Africana Studies Department at Utica University, and also Professor of History and Africana Studies. Thank you so much for being here. Did I get that title right?
Good enough. Good
Oh,
enough,
good
sir.
enough. Well,
Good
wait a
enough, sir.
minute. Good enough.
Good enough.
Let
Good
me.
enough.
So I know you're the chair of the Department of Africana Studies at Utica University.
The director of Africana Studies. It's a program, not a department.
Oh, director. Okay, so that's where I got it. Okay. So we wanted to invite Dr. Harris on to talk about a project 2025, which has gotten so much publicity in the community in the nation about what that agenda is, whether that's going to be adopted by Donald Trump should he prevail in this election cycle. And the other thing is, but not too many people have actually read the entire thing. And so this week, or last week actually, Dr. Harris gave a talk at the Bethany Baptist Church where he broke it down for us to give us an opportunity to understand what it could mean if adopted by the GOP and potentially Donald Trump. And before we came on the air, you basically talked about, with just a few weeks left, a week and a half really, a week and a couple of days left for the election, the trepidation, the angst, the uncertainty, the anxiety. What other words can I come up with?
I think you hit the most important synonyms right there.
Right, right. And so let's start right there with how we're feeling and then get into the document.
Right. So, first and foremost, I want to thank you for having me on to continue what I think is a very important community discussion about Project 2025. And as I have shared with virtually all communities across both the 21st and 22nd congressional districts, that it is my informed opinion that this president electoral cycle will likely be, I'm not a prophet, I can't tell you what the future will bring, but I can talk to you about the ways in which the current historical moment in which we find ourselves has historical precedent. I can talk to you about the antecedent periods as a way of providing some type of context for understanding this current moment. And as I've shared with numerous communities, as I talked about Project 2025, I see this particular electoral cycle as likely being as consequential as the 1860 presidential election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I say that because the nation is in a battle to determine its soul, who it will represent. As you are aware, Brother Kilpatrick, and maybe your audience may not be, I am completing a historical assessment of American democracy from the early 19th century, the abolition era, to the late 20th century. And I'm really trying to understand across that span of time one particular question. Why has the nation had such a difficult time addressing its 18th century liberal ideas? Those liberal ideas are basically philosophical points about human rights, that all men and women are created equal, endowed by their creator to all possess certain unalienable rights by virtue of being human. And within the context of the Declaration of Independence, that particular philosophical manifestation comes in the form of three phrases that we're all familiar with: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Um, well, the nation right now is having a major moment over who gets to receive the unalienable rights associated with those very clearly articulated ideas rooted in the doctrine of human rights. As we seek to really put forth new thoughts of understanding through the manifestation of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIB, belonging. Um, it is really manifesting itself in a very deeply entrenched pushback. Said differently, inclusion for some has been viewed as exclusion for others in this particular moment in time. And yet, this particular moment in time is not new in terms of the tension around inclusion when we start to think about who got to receive the unalienable rights that are initially articulated within the Declaration of Independence.
And so we find ourselves, as you would say, at such a time as this. And so, what, in the context of Project 2025, do we need to be concerned about if that is adopted, if the president if Donald Trump is elected?
So I think that's a really great question. As you have rightly articulated for your audience, it is a very big document. It's a 1,000-page document. And I'm fairly certain, although I have no empirical evidence to support this, that the producers, the authors of this document were fairly certain that the average American was not going to sit down and read a 1,000-page document. But it is important to understand the basic tenets of this document. And what the document seeks to do, very simply, is to expand the executive branch of government in a way that it has not really been reflected in, quite frankly, ever in the United States, in the sense that it seeks to take independent federal agencies like the Department of Justice, remove that autonomy, place them directly under the president. So the Department of Justice, the FBI, all would be agencies that would be directly answerable to the president. The director of the FBI, which currently has term limits, the project seeks to eliminate term limits. Some of your younger listeners may not be aware of the infamous legacy of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the first director of the FBI, who came into that position during the World War I era, was largely responsible for essentially setting Marcus Garvey up and having him ultimately removed from the country. He was deported. And he was also someone who weaponized information. He used information as a weapon to ultimately to attack the civil rights movement. And so to basically put forward a program or a policy that would take such term limits off of the director, but more importantly, to take that agency and put it directly under a president, holds very serious implications about the very meaning of justice. Additionally, what the project seeks to do is to expand executive authority in a way that reflects a type of unitary executive theory. And For those who think that conservative government means, or conservative ideas means reducing the size of government and focusing on the small person, the little guy, returning the government to the people, this is quite the opposite of that. Um, I want to take a moment here just to break that down a little further. The current structure of the federal government, Brother Kilpatrick, really reflects the structure that came out of the New Deal era. Prior to the New Deal, the federal government did not reflect the current size and power that it reflects. The strongest governments prior to the New Deal really were the local governments and then the state governments. The federal government did not have the power that it possesses and the size that it possesses currently prior to the Great Depression. Following the Great Depression, the federal government expanded because of the failure of the market to address the human needs of the nation itself. So the federal government was expanded. It was expanded to provide a social safety net. It was expanded to help rebuild the middle class. It was expanded to ensure a new era of progressive reform that would come into play. This was seen by conservatives as a form of statism, where the state was moving into areas that were previously controlled by the market. And in this particular context, what Project 2025 seeks to do is to disrupt, if not to dismantle, the federal government as we know it today, the structure that came out of the New Deal moment of the early 1930s. The implications of that are absolutely astronomical because of the ways in which the expanded federal state has direct impact on our domestic lives. And I will pause there for any additional questions you might have.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're basically providing us is the potential harm, right? That would come as a result of this. Because as you were talking, what I was thinking is if this were to, I mean, obviously they would have to, some people, so let me go to this. Some people would say they would have to get congressional authority, it seems, to enact many of these proposals, right? And so some have suggested, Dr. Clemmie Harris, that this is much ado about nothing because they can't just unilaterally do, he wouldn't be able to unilaterally do the things that this Project 2025, that he pretends that he doesn't know what it is, that he would need Congress to do some of these things, right? Which, of course, if he had Congress, he could do it, right? If he had the House, if he had the Senate, he could do it, which also begs the question for down ballot races. Look, I'm not a supporter of that man. I've said it on the record here. I find him to be a despicable person, and yet millions of people are lining up to support that, and by default, potentially this Project 2025. So when you hear people say it's much ado about nothing, I would dare say that you wouldn't agree with that. And if so, what should we be concerned? What are the other things we should be concerned about? Because you gave us a couple of things. I understand that one of those other things would be the potential abolishment of the Department of Education, for example. So with all that being said, when people say it's much ado about nothing, would you please help to inform them whether you think it is or isn't much ado about nothing?
So I would argue very much to the contrary. This is a very big deal. First and foremost, some of the changes can take place unilaterally utilizing an executive order, right? Schedule F is a great example of that. But a lot of the other broader structural transformations will require the conservative Republicans to have control over both houses of Congress. But here is the rub, right? The rub here is that what many people don't know is that a 180-day plan is already in place for each department. This has been very carefully thought out. If Donald Trump becomes president, and I'm not trying to engage in fear mongering, I'm only stating facts. If Donald Trump becomes president, the Democrats lose control of the Senate, and the Republicans remain in control of the House. They will have both houses of Congress, the presidency, and they already have a conservative supermajority in the Supreme Court. Now, that is very important because surely a vast restructuring of the federal government is going to trigger Supreme Court challenges. Now, people may say, well, the Supreme Court is not political. It functions largely as the major arbiters of the Constitution, and therefore it only deals with questions of law to a significant degree. Yes. However, the interpretations are political. And therefore, we cannot assume that politics doesn't enter into the interpretations of the Constitution as the various members of the Constitution are making their decisions on particular questions. That, along with the reality that the project has established a 180-degree window by which all departments can be transformed to reflect the very conservative vision of the project means that this is something that can happen, and it can happen fairly quickly. Let me give additional context. In 1994, when Newt Gingrich emerges as when he emerges and seizes control as the Speaker of the House of Representatives, that particular period was a period wherein, in the modern era of American conservatism, more policies came through to restructure or to push back on the liberal policies of the Great Society, of the War on Poverty, of the New Deal. Those policies that came through under Newt Gingrich's control ultimately were designed to push back against the liberal policies that came into existence beginning as early as the New Deal and moving all the way up through the decade of the 1960s. This was a period wherein we saw how the conservatives sought to really weaponize poverty. We saw the ways in which Black reproductive power was ultimately criminalized because Black people found themselves in poverty. And this notion that somehow or another that Black people and brown people in poverty were responsible for the explosion of the nation's deficit because of its social programs was absolutely mythological. It was a myth. It was a complete myth. Set aside the fact that welfare largely was developed to really address the broader issues that all Americans were facing. And because of the racist politics of the early 1930s, Blacks were denied and even placed on the welfare rolls. But that didn't prevent the ways in which racism, classism, and sexism intersected to create this myth. And Brother Kilpatrick, you remember the term of the Black welfare queen, right? Mm-hmm. The one who had all of these licenses and various IDs, who was making all of this money off of the public. A myth, but it was a myth with consequences. It's in this moment that we see a conservative assault on American liberalism, and it was largely through the lens of race, and it was largely policy driven. That's a very important context because, unlike the Contract for America, which was about policy, Project 2025 is about the very structure of the federal government. And philosophically, what the architects of Project 2025 argue is this. They say, look, uh, even though the Contract for America and American conservatism did push the needle forward with regards to policy, if the conservative moment is really to take hold, they argue that the entire structure of the federal government must be fundamentally altered. In other words, this is still a liberal structure for the federal government. And in their imagination, conservatism cannot truly take hold unless the very foundations of the federal government are transformed, beginning with a massive expansion of executive power.
So when we think about so how then best, Dr. Harris, do we those of I mean, because you give us a little surface idea of what this means to us. Given where we are, and we're again a week and a half from the election, how critically how much more can you say to the potential of something like this being enacted? What else do we need to know about this project 2025?
Well, I think quite frankly that it's going to touch every aspect of government. You heard me talk about the significance of the Department of Education. The Department of Education is, look, these agencies are all have their particular flaws, right? But, Department of Education is extremely important when it comes to providing funding, particularly to urban education systems, largely because if you're looking at urban education, particularly in Rust Belt cities, you're going to be looking at educational systems that are going through very dynamic transformation, in part because there's still disparities around funding, and in part because this is a very fluid moment in terms of demographic change, right? Depending on where you look within the 22nd Congressional District alone, let's take the city of Utica. There are 10 different languages that are being spoken in Utica, right? Meaning that English as a second language, having the funding for that is going to be extremely important. Equally important is going to be having federal dollars to ensure that school boards and school districts have the ability of being able to hire teachers that have the responsibility of educating working class children, many of whom might be the first in their generation or the first in their families, I would say, to attend college. Um, this is the access to the American dream, right? It begins with education. We say that education is the great equalizer. Well, if we eliminate the Department of Education, then the question becomes, how then do we provide a basis for ensuring continuity of support for these particular systems? But that's not the only area in which there should be concern. There should also be concern with regards to the fact that when it comes to healthcare, the Project 2025 is mandating that the FDA reduce the ability for Americans, and particularly women, to have a say in their reproductive health. They are going to eliminate, they want to eliminate the FDA's approval of abortion pills and instead push new alternatives like adoption, push biblically based, familiar structures. Now, Brother Kilpatrick, I'm a Christian. But I'm also someone that understands the very toxic nature when church and state comes together, right? And so to think about the various religions that are a part of this society, and then to think about how the federal government will now mandate a, a biblically based structure of family uh, runs the risk of really seeking to do more harm than good. There is a reason why the founding fathers made sure that there will be separation of church and state. And yet we can clearly understand that this notion of a biblically based familial structure is a direct response to DEIA work, right? I want to go back one more to the Department of Education because I want to make it very clear to your listeners that they will also seek to criminalize DEIA work. They will seek to criminalize critical race theory. They will seek to criminalize transgender identity. All of these particular attacks are the response to a moment where the nation is really having a tough conversation about who gets not only to be a citizen, but to receive the full rights of citizenship. And so Project 2025 has a very deeply entrenched cultural response to the cultural stimulants to make this nation truly a multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse society.
Some of the other highlights include mass deportations, warrantless surveillance, unleashing undue force on protesters, severely limiting voting access, and censoring, and this has got to be of concern to you, Dr. Harris, censoring academic discussions about race, gender, systemic oppression, among other things. And you also talked about rolling back trans rights and things of that nature. So, I mean, that, and I just went through all of those things are egregious, including the things that you already talked about. So I do think that we got to wake up because there seems to be, I got to end with this, Dr. Harris, and maybe you can speak to this. There seems to be some sort of fantasy around this candidacy for Donald Trump in his own world and in the minds of some of us as well. And so can you just help us with that piece? Because,
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely. I want to add on to that wonderful addition. One of the things that they also seek to do is to stop cybersecurity efforts.
Mm.
They do not want the cybersecurity infrastructure, the security agency to engage online propaganda campaigns. In fact, what the project argues is that the federal government should not make judgment calls on what is true and what isn't. In other
Okay.
words, they want disinformation to be a norm, and your audience should understand the distinction between misinformation
And
and
this.
disinformation,
Mm.
right? Misinformation is unintentional. At some point, we all engage in a form of misinformation because of the limitations of what we understand, right? But it is unintentional and it is ultimately not the reflection of a individual's desire to do harm. Disinformation is the opposite. Disinformation is intentional and its efforts to misinform, and it is intentional in its efforts to do harm. I now want to take a moment to speak to the issue because I think that the issue that you are really seeking to ask me is how do we account for Black people who have become very vociferous in their support of Donald Trump. I want to begin by saying first and foremost that we should not equate um, uh, ideology with biology, right?
Hmm.
That those who ultimately subscribe to the MAGA mantra are invested in ideology. This is an ideological choice that has nothing to do with biology. And I say that because it is important that your listeners know that race itself is ideological, that from a biological perspective, despite your physical difference, all human beings are 99.99% the same. How we differ is among culture and politics. Said differently, you can you cannot choose your color, but you can choose your commitments. You can't choose your parents, but you can choose your politics. There is a really important point because if we understand that, then we know that this is a choice. And it is a choice to invest in the MAGA mantra, which is really about whiteness, and I'm not talking about whiteness from an individual perspective. I'm talking about whiteness as a structure, as a superstructure of politics, as a superstructure that ultimately shapes our economics, shapes who gets access, who receives rewards. This particular structure has very long roots, Brother Kilpatrick, that goes back to the transatlantic slave system itself. And this is important for the listeners to understand. Just as there were African leaders who engaged in transactions with European slavers, who sought to shift from commodities and gold and spices and cotton or textiles to human beings as commodities. They did so because it conferred or produced a reward. That was the original sort of example as to how Black people can ultimately engage in a system that is on its face very, very onerous, very detrimental to other Black people because to do so, A, is a reflection of a choice, B, it is ideological, and C, it confers a reward. Why else would you do it? Fast
Hmm.
forward from that period to the present, and you will find that the investment here is around grievance, there is anger. So they are identifying with Trump because Trump is a populist. He says nothing of a rational nature. His whole objective is to burn it down, but to burn it down with the realization that there is something in its place. And that which is in its place is Project 2025. But the other part of this is the notion that under Trump, these individuals will be economically better off than they are under Democratic policies. So this is about recognizing that investment in MAGA mantra or the MAGA mantra or the MAGA world is about investing in a structure of whiteness. And it's being done largely because of two main driving motives: anger and the notion that there will be a reward from investing in such a system.
Dr. Clemmie Harris, Director of Africana Studies at Utica University and Associate Professor of History, thank you for breaking it down for us, and thank you for coming on and sounding the alarm, right? And even as you describe what you just described, I'm hoping that people understand that this election, as you stated at the top, as important as any since 1860. Okay? Think about that. Since the election of Abraham Lincoln, this election potentially has the same um, consequence and or what's the word to use? Uh, Importance.
Implications. Yes, yes,
Implications.
absolutely.
Implications. Thank you for that. So, Dr. Harris, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time. This is a radio show, so we don't have so much time to get into it, but I do thank you for the time and more to come. I'm sure we'll have you back.
I look forward to coming back. Thank you all. Thank you.
And we should mention you're a former candidate for Congress. Did you want to say anything about why you
Well,
left the race?
thank you for that. I simply would simply say that the reason I decided to run is because of what I saw. That is the only reason that I decided to run. I believe that I could use the lessons of history and particularly the long Black freedom struggle as a very important vehicle to help this country move forward. We are in a struggle. And I think that struggle is simply the natural progression of trying to honor these 18th century liberal ideas. And the march that we're moving toward is multiracialism, multi-ethnic society that is diverse. And the history says with every stage of inclusion, there has been pushback. That is why Dr. King says, that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. It bends slowly, but it does bend eventually towards justice.
Clemmie Harris, Dr. Clemmie Harris, thank you so much for joining us here on Inspiration for the Nation.